The night was silent, the sea like glass. Everyone remembers the ship that sank, but almost no one remembers the people who vanished with it. 1,500 lives, gone. And somehow the world never truly noticed.
I hit the water with a terrific crack. Luckily, I didn't hit anything when I dropped in. There were bodies all over the place. And then I looked up at the Titanic.
For those who lived through that night, the memories never faded. For those who didn't, the world barely spoke their names.
Lost him then. He went down with the Titanic.
This is their story, the ones history forgot. The people who died on the Titanic and how no one seemed to notice. They came from everywhere. Finland, Ireland, Syria, Sweden. Dreamers, workers, mothers with children wrapped in shawls. The Titanic wasn't just a ship, it was a floating promise. In the lowest decks were people who had sold everything they owned for a one-way ticket to a new life. They called it steerage. The world called it third class. To them, the ocean wasn't a luxury, it was hope itself. When the ship left Southampton on April 10, 1912, there were more than 700 passengers in third class. Fathers carrying dreams across the Atlantic, young women seeking work, children who had never seen an ocean before. Their names filled page after page. But when the news broke days later, few of those names ever reached print. The headlines told of millionaires, of John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man aboard, of Isidore Straus of Macy's, of Benjamin Guggenheim, dressed in evening wear as he faced the sea. But what of the Sages, a family of 11 from Kent, or the Panelas, a young Finnish mother and her 5 children, or the Goodwins, parents and 6 children, all gone? Their faces didn't sell newspapers. Their stories quietly disappeared beneath the front-page tragedy of the elite. The Sage family were farmers from Stoke Poges in southern England. John and Annie Sage had spent years saving for a better life in Florida, where they hoped to open a small hotel. They sold their farm, packed their belongings, and boarded the Titanic with their 9 children. Witnesses remembered them singing in the lower decks on the evening of April 14, hymns about crossing over to the Promised Land. Hours later, every one of them was gone. Their family line ended in a single night. The Panula family came from Ilistaro, Finland. A carpenter named Juha, his wife Maria, and their 5 sons, the youngest only a toddler. They were bound for Pennsylvania, where Juha planned to work in the steel mills and send for relatives once settled. When the iceberg struck, they were trapped in the freezing corridors of third class. No one ever saw them again. Decades later, scientists would identify the remains of one of the boys, a child of about 2, through DNA, proving at last that even the tiniest victim had a name, Aino Panula. The Goodwins were a working-class family from Wiltshire, England. Frederick Goodwin had been offered a job maintaining electrical systems for a hotel in New York. He and his wife Augusta brought their 6 children aboard, excited to start a new chapter. On deck, other passengers remembered the children chasing each other, full of life, but they never reached the lifeboats. When recovery ships searched the area days later, several small bodies were found together, dressed neatly by a mother who must have known what was coming. For years, one child's grave in Halifax was marked the unknown child, until DNA testing revealed it was their son, Sidney Goodwin. In third class, survival wasn't luck, it was access. When the iceberg tore open the starboard hull, many below didn't even feel the impact. By the time the alarm spread, the corridors were flooding. Metal gates meant to keep classes separate slowed their escape. The lights flickered. Directions were shouted in languages many couldn't understand. Some prayed, some sang hymns. Some waited for someone to come, but help never came. Out of more than 700 souls in third class, barely 1 in 4 survived. The rest, entire families, entire bloodlines, vanished into the dark. Days later, when rescue ships returned to search the debris field, they found bodies floating face up, still in life jackets. Most had no identification, just initials sewn inside coats, or numbers assigned when they were buried. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, rows of small gray stones still carry a single word: unknown. Beneath each one lies a story history never told. We remember the ship for its scale, But we rarely remember the people who filled its hallways, the ones who laughed in the dining rooms, who sang to restless children, who believed the ocean could take them somewhere better. When the Titanic sank, it wasn't just metal that disappeared beneath the waves. It was thousands of unfinished stories. And for decades, those stories stayed there, sealed in the silence of the North Atlantic, forgotten by the headlines, forgotten by time. The faces that once filled the ship's photographs became shadows, until someone, years later, began to look again. The ocean never forgets. It keeps everything, the steel, the shoes, the names carved into boarding lists, waiting for someone to listen. The Titanic was a ship divided, not by walls alone, but by belief. Above deck, there was elegance and laughter, a floating palace of chandeliers and string quartets. Below, the air smelled of coal dust and sweat, two worlds sharing the same steel frame, but never truly meeting. The ship's design mirrored the society that built it. The wealthy lived above, surrounded by warmth and luxury. The middle class stayed in the modest cabins below them. And at the bottom, out of sight, were those who had paid the least but carried the most hope. The divide was more than physical, it was moral and absolute. When the iceberg struck, that divide became fatal. The first-class passengers were closest to the boat deck. They were told calmly to dress warmly and prepare to evacuate. Many didn't even believe the ship was sinking. How could the unsinkable die on its first voyage? But below deck, confusion spread faster than the water itself. The sound of rushing seawater echoed through narrow halls. Lights flickered, shadows leaped across the walls. Some tried to climb the stairways to safety, only to find the gates locked. Crewmen, following orders, kept them closed to prevent disorder. It was order that killed them. Survivors described families in steerage crowding behind those barriers, pleading to be let through. Mothers clutching babies, men shouting for help. But the gates didn't open until it was too late. By then, the water had reached their waists. While panic rose below, disbelief ruled above. The first lifeboats were launched half empty. Some passengers refused to leave, waiting for rescue that never came. Others stood frozen, unwilling to abandon the glowing decks for the black ocean below. As the ship tilted, the music played on. It wasn't courage alone, it was denial. They had been told this ship could not sink, and many clung to that belief until the sea swallowed the lights around them. In the end, survival came down to timing and trust. A woman who hesitated for minutes might never see morning. A man who ignored an officer's call could vanish beneath the waves. And for the hundreds trapped below, the end came quietly without witness. Days later, the numbers told the truth more clearly than any story. Nearly 62% of first-class passengers survived, half of those in second class. But in third class, only 174 of more than 700 escaped. Their deaths weren't caused by the iceberg alone. They were the result of design, of class, of a belief that some lives mattered more. In the frozen stillness of that night, the Titanic revealed something beyond tragedy. It showed the cruel order of a world that prized wealth over humanity. Even as the sea rose to claim them, the invisible divide held. And when the ship finally broke apart, the ocean washed away the last illusion of safety, for rich and poor alike. Somewhere in that darkness, distinctions ceased to matter. For the first time, everyone, from millionaires to migrants, faced the same cold truth together. The sea does not know your name. It only remembers who was left behind. When dawn broke over the North Atlantic, the sea was calm again. But where the Titanic had once been, there was nothing. Only empty water and drifting debris. The screams had faded hours earlier. Now there was only silence. Lifeboats floated aimlessly, scattered across miles of ocean. Women called into the fog, names swallowed by the wind. Children whispered questions no one could answer. Far beyond the horizon, the lights of another ship appeared. Too late to save, only to collect what was left. The Carpathia arrived at daybreak. Crew members pulled the frozen survivors aboard, one by one. Among them were the faces of grief itself. Women in soaked gowns, stokers trembling from cold, sailors staring into nothing. They had lived, but part of them was still in the water. Captain Rostron ordered the ship to turn around immediately. Its passengers watched in silence as survivors huddled together, too numb to speak. No one celebrated, only disbelief and the unbearable knowledge of how many were gone. For days, newspapers around the world fought for the story. The unsinkable ship had sunk, but the headlines told a selective truth. They wrote of courage and sacrifice, of orchestra players who went down playing. They told of wealth, of jewels and legends, but not of the hundreds with no photographs, no voice, and no place in history. There were no front-page stories for the sages, the Panulas, or the good ones. Their names appeared in small print. Steerage passengers, missing, presumed dead. To the world above, they were statistics, not stories. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, cable ships were sent to recover what the sea had left behind. Men worked in grim silence, lifting hundreds of bodies from the freezing water. They wrapped them in canvas, logged their possessions, and lowered them into the ground. 3 cemeteries became the final resting place for over 150 souls. Only a few could be identified. The rest were buried under stones that bore a single word: unknown. Some graves were marked only with numbers. One stone read, "Known unto God." Others were identified by a pair of boots, a pocket watch, a wedding ring worn thin by salt. The world mourned the Titanic as a tragedy of progress, not of people. Even in death, the divide remained. The names of the wealthy were remembered. The poor were buried under silence. For the families left behind, there was no closure. Letters went unanswered. Bodies were never found. Some waited years, refusing to believe their loved ones were gone. Others received only a telegram, a few cold words to mark a vanished world. In the decades that followed, the Titanic became myth. Hollywood rewrote its story. Books romanticized its final hours. But the silence of those who truly suffered, the ones who froze in the black water, the ones whose names no one learned, remained untouched. If you walk through Fairview Lawn Cemetery today, you can still see those rows of graves, each one identical, each one cold to the touch. And if you stand there long enough, the wind sounds almost like the sea. The silence that followed the Titanic wasn't just the end of a voyage, it was the beginning of forgetting. For decades, the Titanic lay untouched, hidden under nearly 4 kilometers of freezing darkness. The world moved on. Wars were fought, nations changed, but beneath the Atlantic, the ship remained exactly as it had fallen, a time capsule sealed in ice and silence. The wreck was discovered in 1985, 73 years after it vanished. The first images that came back were ghostly. Rust-covered railings, chandeliers still hanging in the deep, shoes scattered across the seafloor. Every object seemed to whisper a name that history had erased. But among the twisted metal, what struck the world most were the small things. A child's pair of shoes, a hairbrush with strands still tangled in its bristles, a violin, its wood preserved by salt and cold. These weren't relics of a disaster, they were fragments of lives. Evidence that people once laughed, hoped, and dreamed inside those walls. For the first time, the Titanic story shifted. It was no longer about the ship, it was about the souls who had filled it. Researchers began matching artifacts to names. In laboratories across the world, geneticists examined remains recovered from the sea. Through DNA, they reconnected stories that had been lost for generations. One of those belonged to a little boy, a toddler found floating in the North Atlantic. For almost a century, no one knew who he was. His grave in Halifax was marked only as the unknown child. Visitors would place toys and flowers beside it, whispering prayers for a baby without a name. In 2007, DNA testing confirmed the truth. He was Sidney Goodwin, the youngest son of the family who had boarded in Southampton, full of hope for a new life. After 95 years, the child who had symbolized every unknown victim finally had his name returned to him. Another belonged to Aino Panula, one of the Finnish brothers lost with his mother and 4 siblings. For years, his identity was uncertain, confused with others. But when DNA evidence was revisited decades later, scientists found his story again. A story of a tiny boy who had once clutched his mother's hand, believing they were sailing towards safety. Through each discovery, the Titanic's silence began to break. Museums filled with letters, photographs, and artifacts, pieces of a tragedy that was slowly becoming human again. a postcard written the day before the ship sank, a pocket watch stopped forever at 2:20 a.m., a locket containing a photograph of a woman's face, still visible through glass clouded by seawater. Every object was a conversation across time, a whisper from the deep saying, "We were here." And for descendants, it meant something far greater than history. For the Sage family, researchers traced surviving relatives in England who had grown up hearing only rumors that their ancestors had gone missing at sea. When they learned the truth, they visited the graves in Halifax and wept for names they had never known but always carried. Each rediscovery brought something back to life, not the people, but the dignity of remembering them. Today, the Titanic rests quietly, slowly dissolving under the weight of time. Microbes eat away at its steel bones, turning the ship back into dust and rust. One day it will vanish completely, but its human story will remain. Because now, every object, every name, every family that was once forgotten has found its way back into the light. The Titanic no longer belongs to myth or movie screens. It belongs to the real people, the Sages, the Panulas, the Goodwins, whose stories were once drowned by silence. They were never famous, they never made headlines, but now, more than a century later, the world finally knows they existed. In that way, the ocean has done what history could not. It has kept their memories alive. Beneath miles of darkness, the sea preserved their stories until we were finally ready to listen. The Titanic was built to be perfect, a triumph of steel and pride. But its story became a mirror for what we forget, that progress without empathy always sinks. In 1912, the world mourned a ship. Few mourned the people. The wealthy became legend, the poor, a footnote. Yet it was the poor who built the ship, fed its fires, and steered it through the night, unseen, unheard, and unremembered. The Titanic didn't just sink into the ocean, it sank into our conscience. It showed how quickly confidence can turn to tragedy when compassion fails. Every chandelier and brass rail was built to prove mastery over nature, and nature answered with silence. That silence is the lesson. Power fades. What lasts are the choices made when others need us. Some gave up their seats. Some stayed behind with strangers. Even in terror, humanity flickered. Ask the survivors what they remember, and they speak of quiet. Not the crash, not the music, but the stillness after the screams. A silence so complete it still echoes. The true tragedy isn't only that the Titanic sank, it's that so many lives vanished and the world moved on. They had faces, laughter, dreams, and for years no one noticed. A century later, the wreck rusts away, but its meaning endures. The ocean remembers everything, even when we forget. Beneath the waves lies more than iron, a monument of voices waiting to be heard. Listen closely and the current still whispers, "We were here. We mattered."